All right, so, we've been seeing a lot happening lately with Ukraine and Sudan and the Middle East.
Yeah.
And it can feel like, just looking at the headlines, just a bunch of separate crises just kind of popping up.
Hmm.
But we've been digging into a bunch of sources for today's deep dive.
Right.
News reports, analyses from some really interesting military minds, and a bunch of statements from political leaders.
Yeah.
And the more we look at all this stuff, the more it's starting to feel like a much bigger and more complicated picture than just these isolated events, Kind of
Absolutely.
a lot of connections between all of these.
Yeah, it's really fascinating when you start to sort of put these situations side by side and you see how events that on the surface seem completely separate can actually reflect these larger global dynamics or even influence each other.
Right. Yeah.
It's almost like, a giant machine, and if you push on one part of it,
Hmm.
it can have some really unexpected consequences somewhere else entirely. And that's kind of what we're seeing playing out right now in a lot of ways.
Okay, so let's jump into Ukraine first, because there's been some pretty intense stuff happening there lately.
Yeah.
We saw that huge drone attack from Russia on Odessa,
Right.
and this was, by some accounts, one of the largest drone attacks that's ever been recorded.
Yeah, it was massive.
What's particularly interesting to me is the timing of it, because it happened when the Czech president Petr Pavel was visiting.
Oh, wow.
And he's a very vocal supporter of Ukraine, in the EU.
Right. Yeah.
And from what we're hearing from Ukrainian officials, there were casualties and fires.
Yeah.
Pretty bad ones.
Yeah, that's terrible. And it's not just the size of the attack that really struck me,
Yeah.
but the Ukrainian military analyst, Oleksandr Kovalenko, was saying that Russia seems to be changing up its tactics.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, think about this. They're sending these drones in at super high speeds from really high altitudes.
Oh, wow.
So if you imagine trying to shoot down something that's moving that fast and coming straight down, it makes it so much harder for air defenses to react and get a lock.
Right.
Kovalenko actually called it terror against the civilian population, which really gets at the intended psychological impact in addition to whatever military objectives they might have had.
Wow. Yeah, that's heavy stuff.
Yeah, it is.
So just the sheer numbers here are pretty mind-blowing.
Hmm.
The Ukrainian Air Force said that 214 drones were launched total in that wave. They said they shot down 114 and another 81 were neutralized by what they're calling electronic warfare,
Right.
which, I don't know if everyone's familiar with that, but it basically uses electromagnetic energy to mess with the enemy's electronics, like their control systems for the drones.
Yeah, it's like jamming their signals,
Right,
so
exactly.
they can't control them properly.
But even with those numbers, a good chunk still got through.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And the fact that both sides are constantly changing up their tactics really just shows how dynamic this conflict is.
Right,
It's this constant back and forth of adapt and counter-adapt.
right.
And it's almost like every time they think they've agreed on something like avoiding energy infrastructure as a target, well, we've seen a bunch more accusations about that very thing recently.
Yeah, and then we had that explosion at the Sudza gas pumping station over in Russia's Kursk region.
Right.
And that's a key bit of infrastructure because it used to handle a lot of the gas exports that Gazprom sent to Europe. And Russian forces had only just retaken it after some heavy fighting.
Yeah, and of course the blame game started right away.
Oh, of course.
Moscow saying it was a Ukrainian terrorist attack,
Right.
Kiev denying anything to do with it, and even hinting that it might have been a Russian false flag operation.
Wow, that's so cynical.
Yeah, well, it wouldn't be the first time.
Right.
I mean, what's interesting here is how each side uses these events to shape their own narrative, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Like the Russian Ministry of Defense actually came out and directly blamed Ukraine for the Sudza station attack, saying it was a deliberate attempt to derail the peace initiatives that Trump's been floating.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, they even specifically mentioned that it was meant to discredit his efforts. So even if it wasn't actually true, it could be a way for Russia to blame any failure of these peace talks on Ukraine
Right.
and potentially, weaken the support that the West is giving to Kiev.
Wow, that's a pretty calculated move.
Oh, yeah, they're playing the long game here.
And then to make things even worse, we had that other explosion at an oil depot in the Krasnodar region of southern Russia.
Right.
And local authorities confirmed that it was a Ukrainian drone strike.
Wow.
And the fire spread so fast, it covered over 10,000 square meters.
That's huge.
Yeah, it is. And 2 firefighters were injured.
Oh, no.
And they even detected dangerous levels of benzene in the air.
That's terrible.
So with all these significant strikes happening on both sides and targeting critical infrastructure, it's hard to imagine any talk of a ceasefire being taken seriously right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a fragile situation. We know that the U.S. has been trying to broker a limited ceasefire that just focuses on energy infrastructure. And there were some verbal agreements from both Moscow and Kiev on that specific point.
Right.
But Putin reportedly rejected a broader 30-day ceasefire.
Oh, wow.
And now with this new round of attacks and all these public accusations, the upcoming meeting in Saudi Arabia to discuss these proposals is looking incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
There's just so much distrust. And it seems like both sides are basically assuming that the other is deliberately trying to sabotage any chance of diplomatic progress.
Right. So where does that leave Europe in all of this?
That's a really good question.
I mean, we saw Zelensky make a direct address to the European Council in Brussels.
Yeah.
And his message was pretty straightforward. You know, with the U.S. potentially changing its commitment under a new administration, Europe really has to step up and take on even more responsibility.
Yeah, that makes sense.
He emphasized how crucial it is for Ukraine to keep getting that growing support from its European partners.
This is where things get really interesting because it raises this question of whether Europe is actually ready and willing to take the lead here.
Right.
Zelensky specifically said, Europe must always be at the table when its own security is being discussed. And that's a direct reference to Putin's idea of maybe negotiating Ukraine's future directly with Trump and cutting Europe out of the process entirely.
Oh, wow.
It's a clear signal that Ukraine doesn't want to be sidelined in any future. Talks about its own fate and the security of the whole continent.
So what was Europe's response to all of this?
Well, the leaders agreed to increase the pressure on Moscow, and there's been talk of more sanctions.
Oh, okay.
But as we've seen before, there's always internal disagreement on how to actually implement these measures.
Right.
Some countries have weaker economies, or they're focused on other pressing issues like Spain and Italy, are really focused on conflicts in the south and the whole migration situation.
Right.
So they're often hesitant about anything that could have a big impact on their economy or society.
And that's not even getting into the whole issue of funding the rearmament effort.
Yeah, that's a big one.
The European Commission proposed this massive 150 billion euro loan plan for defense investments. But there are still so many unanswered questions.
Like who actually gets to use these funds? What even counts as a defense investment?
Right.
And probably the most important question of all is how will this affect the EU's existing debt limits?
Because they're still dealing with the economic fallout from the pandemic.
Exactly. So it's understandable that they're hesitant to take on a ton of new debt for defense.
It is, yeah. So where does the UK fit into all of this?
Well, they're doing some interesting things, too.
Okay.
Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party over there,
Right.
he's likely going to be the next prime minister.
Okay.
And he was recently in meetings with some Western military planners.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is that he seems to be moving away from the idea of sending British ground troops to Ukraine.
Really?
Yeah. He's suggesting that their contribution would be more focused on naval and air support.
Huh. That's a pretty big shift.
It is, and this could be a sign that the UK and maybe some other allies are starting to worry about how sustainable it is to provide large-scale military aid over the long term.
Right.
They might be moving towards a more targeted approach to avoid a direct conflict with Moscow.
That makes sense. So what's the overall takeaway from all of this?
It seems like the conversation is shifting away from these huge immediate aid packages and more towards the practical challenge of just getting enough munitions to Ukraine.
Okay.
Despite all the public statements about unity and support, there seems to be a real impasse on how much to spend and how to actually allocate those resources to meet Ukraine's most urgent needs.
So it sounds like Zelensky's right to be concerned.
Yeah, I mean, he knows that with the U.S. potentially changing its policy, Ukraine's ability to defend itself really hinges on the support it gets from Brussels.
Right.
The big question now is whether the EU can and will actually take the lead if the U.S. steps back.
It's a big if.
It is, for sure.
So let's shift gears now and talk about Sudan, where there's been some pretty significant developments in the civil war there.
Yeah.
The Sudanese army announced that they retook the presidential palace in Khartoum.
Right.
And there were even images of soldiers inside this partially destroyed building, which was the seat of executive power before all the fighting started.
It was definitely a symbolic victory for the army.
Totally.
It had a lot of weight.
Right. And the information minister even posted on X, formerly Twitter, celebrating the raising of the flag and saying that their fight for victory continues.
Right.
But as important as this recapture is, it doesn't necessarily mean the fighting is over.
No, not at all.
The Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, under Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, haven't publicly admitted defeat.
Yeah, and in fact, There are reports that they're actually expanding their influence in other parts of the country.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, it's pretty concerning.
So what are they doing?
Well, the RSF is claiming that they've taken control of Al-Malia.
Okay.
It's a strategically important city in North Darfur, near the borders with Chad and Libya. And while the Sudanese army has acknowledged that there's fighting in the area, they haven't actually confirmed losing the city.
So this conflict is really evolving geographically.
It is.
It sounds like the army might be making some progress in Khartoum, but the RSF is consolidating its control in the west, particularly in Darfur.
Exactly. And this advance in Darfur could have some serious implications for regional stability beyond Sudan itself. It could impact cross-border dynamics and the flow of resources.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And there's even talk that the RSF might be trying to set up a whole separate administration in Darfur.
Yeah, I heard that too.
Which would be a huge deal.
It's highly unlikely that it would be recognized internationally, but it shows the very real risk of Sudan breaking apart into a divided state.
And on top of all of this, there's the humanitarian crisis.
Yeah, we can't forget about that.
UNICEF has said that Sudan is facing the world's largest humanitarian crisis right now.
It's devastating.
Tens of thousands of people have been killed. Millions have been displaced from their homes, and there's a severe famine.
I even heard reports of families having to eat grass just to survive.
It's heartbreaking.
It is.
And all of this is happening against the backdrop of Sudan's recent history.
Right.
The longtime ruler Omar al-Bashir was overthrown in 2019 after those massive protests.
Right.
And they tried to establish a civilian-led government.
Yeah.
But then in 2021, the two generals who are now fighting each other...
Al-Burhan and Dagalo.
Right. They staged a coup together.
It was a joint military coup, yeah.
And their alliance fell apart pretty quickly, and that led to the open warfare that's been going on since 2023.
Yeah, it's a mess.
Both sides have been accused of horrible human rights abuses, massacres, rapes, ethnic cleansing, even genocide.
And of course, both sides deny everything.
Of course. So it doesn't look like there's an easy solution in sight.
No, it doesn't.
So even though the army recaptured the presidential palace, the overall situation in Sudan is looking pretty grim.
Yeah, it is.
It seems like the country is headed for a long conflict with these distinct areas of control, and the international community doesn't seem to be able to do much about it.
No. And with so much global attention focused on other crises, Sudan's not getting the help it desperately needs.
It's a really tough situation.
It is.
So let's move on to the Middle East, where tensions are still running really high.
Right.
We recently heard from Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei.
Yeah.
And he made a pretty bold statement saying that Iran doesn't need proxies in the region.
Oh, wow.
And that groups like the Houthis in Yemen are acting independently based on their own interests.
Oh, what?
This was a response to Trump's threat to hold Tehran directly responsible for any Houthi attacks.
It's a pretty loaded statement when you think about it.
It is.
He's basically saying that the U.S. is making a huge mistake by calling these regional resistance centers Iranian proxies.
Right.
And he emphasized that the people in Yemen have their own reasons for fighting. He also said that Iran doesn't start conflicts, but it will respond strongly to any attacks against it.
So what does that tell us?
Or it could be a few things. It could be a genuine reflection of the relationship between Iran and these groups. Or it could be a strategic move to deflect blame. Or maybe it's a message aimed at both a domestic Iranian audience and the international community.
And it's important to understand what this axis of resistance that Khamenei keeps talking about actually is.
Yeah, it can be a bit confusing.
It's basically a network of armed groups across the Middle East that oppose the presence and influence of the U.S. and Israel in the region.
Right.
So we're talking about groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shia militias in Iraq,
Right.
Hamas in Gaza, and of course the Houthis in Yemen.
And while these groups generally align with Iran's broader goals of resisting Israel and pushing back against Western influence, it's really important to remember that there are local movements with their own unique histories and ideologies.
Right, so they're not just puppets being controlled by Iran.
Exactly. Khamenei's point about them having their own motivations isn't entirely wrong.
So how should we understand this relationship?
Think about it like the situation with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 80s.
Okay.
The U.S. and these Afghan groups with very different long-term goals found themselves united against a common enemy, the Soviet Union.
Right.
The U.S. provided support, but they didn't control the Mujahideen's every move.
Okay.
It's similar with Iran and these groups.
So it's more about shared interests than direct control.
Exactly.
And when we look at the Houthis specifically, experts who study Yemen point out that they have deep local roots, and their fight is largely about pushing back against Saudi Arabia's influence and trying to control Sana'a and northern Yemen.
Right. They might get support from Iran, but their motivations are rooted in Yemen's own internal dynamics.
It's a complicated situation.
It is, and it's also worth remembering that the U.S. keeps changing its designation of the Houthis. They were labeled as a terrorist group under Trump. Then Biden revoked that designation, and then in 2024, after the Red Sea attacks, they were redesignated as specially designated global terrorists.
So what does that actually mean?
Well, it has significant implications for U.S. foreign policy. It allows them to impose targeted economic sanctions against the Houthis and their financial networks.
So it's a way to try to put pressure on them.
Exactly, but whether it will actually deter them is another question.
And then we have Russia coming out in support of Iran's right to peaceful nuclear energy.
Yeah, that was interesting timing.
Right as the U.S. and Israel are getting ready for high-level talks about Iran's nuclear program.
It just goes to show how complex and interconnected all of these alliances and interests are in the Middle East.
Absolutely. So looking back at everything we've discussed today, we can see some pretty important themes emerging.
Yeah, I agree.
The first is just how fragile any attempts at a ceasefire are. When there's so much mistrust and ongoing conflict, it's incredibly difficult to get everyone to agree to stop fighting, even for a short period of time.
And we're also seeing these major shifts in international alliances and the type of support being offered.
Right.
The U.S. might be stepping back. Europe might be stepping up.
And then underneath all of this, we have the complex interplay between local grievances and the influence of these external actors who are all trying to advance their own strategic goals.
Right. It's never as simple as it looks on the surface.
It definitely isn't. So this leaves us with a lot to think about.
It does.
Given all of these interconnected crises and the challenges we're seeing with diplomacy, what are the long-term implications for global stability and the international order?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is. And as individuals trying to understand the world around us, how do we make sense of this reality where seemingly local conflicts can have such huge global consequences?
It's definitely a lot to consider, and these are issues that are going to continue to shape our world for a long time to come.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for taking this deep dive with us.
My pleasure.
And we encourage everyone listening to keep exploring these incredibly complex and important issues.
Yeah, it's worth it.
All right, that's it for today. Thanks for listening.
See you next time.